Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA, Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. The street was quiet, the glow of the street lights casting long shadows across the suburban neighborhood. Midnight had just passed when Chief Mark Reynolds turned onto his street, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. It had been a grueling 12-hour shift, back-to-back calls, piles of paperwork, and the usual chaos of running a police department. Right now, all he wanted was a hot shower, a cold drink, and uninterrupted sleep. That was before he slammed on his brakes. Blocking his driveway was a massive tow truck, its hazard lights blinking in the darkness. His stomach twisted as his eyes darted toward the empty spot where his car had been parked that morning. It was gone. For a brief second, he considered that maybe a neighbor's car had broken down and they were using his driveway as a temporary tow spot. But then he saw him, the smug-looking guy standing next to the truck, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Kevin, the self-proclaimed HOA enforcer, or, as the neighbors like to call him, the wannabe cop. Mark gripped the steering wheel, inhaling slowly through his nose. Not tonight. He didn't have the patience for HOA nonsense tonight. Shoving his car in a park, he stepped out, his badge still clipped to his belt. "You want to move this truck out of my driveway?" His voice was calm, but the irritation bled through. Kevin barely looked at him before tilting his head toward the empty space. "Should have paid the fine, bud." Mark's pulse ticked in his jaw. "What fine?" Kevin chuckled, lifting his clipboard with exaggerated smugness. "Unpaid balance, $79. Mark blinked. $79? Kevin shrugged, flipping through his clipboard like it was some sacred text. "Yeah, we sent notices. No payment. No warning needed when you ignore them." "I was at work all day," Mark muttered, reaching for his phone. "Not my problem. Rules are rules." Mark scrolled through his inbox. Sure enough, buried under a flood of work emails and spam was an email from the HOA. Subject: Final notice, urgent past due balance, $79, sent 3 hours ago. A slow breath left his nose. He looked up, and Kevin was still grinning like he just won some kind of power trip. "Where's my car?" Mark's voice was flat. Kevin tapped the clipboard. "Impound lot. You can get it back for $250 plus storage fees." Mark's eye twitched. "Let me get this straight. You towed my car over $79 before I even had a chance to read the email, then block my driveway with this truck?" Kevin's smirk widened. "That about sums it up." Mark cracked his neck. He'd arrested gang leaders with less arrogance than this guy. Taking a step forward, he kept his tone calm. "Move the truck." Kevin held up a hand. "Oh, I can't do that. Got to settle the fine first. It's policy." Mark had officially had enough. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number he knew by heart, the non-emergency dispatch line. "Hey, it's Reynolds. I need a traffic obstruction unit at my residence." Kevin's smirk faltered. Whoa, what do you think you're doing?" Mark met his gaze, unblinking. "Getting your truck moved legally." The tow truck driver who had been most. Suddenly, Mark stood straighter. "Wait a minute, man. Are you a cop or something?" Kevin scoffed. "Doesn't matter. This is HOA jurisdiction. Cops can't do squat." Mark took a slow step closer, lowering his voice. "Oh, that's cute." He turned and walked toward his mailbox, flipping it open. Sure enough, there was a physical notice inside. He skimmed it quickly, effective immediately. Chief Mark Reynolds has accrued additional violations totaling $500. His eyes darted down the list of violations. Improperly installed porch light, lawn not in uniform with HOA standards, unauthorized mailbox decor. Mark glanced at his plain black mailbox. There was nothing on it except for a small blue police support sticker. They fined him for that. Kevin, oblivious to the slow-burning rage building in Mark's chest, was still talking. "Oh yeah, you got more fines stacking up, buddy. This is just the start. You homeowners think you own the place, but we run this neighborhood." Mark turned back toward him, his expression unreadable. "You run this neighborhood?" Kevin nodded, arms crossed. "That's right. So you better play by the rules." Mark let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. "Got it." Kevin mistook Mark's calm for submission. "Good. Now, if you want, I can waive some of the additional fines if you pay tonight." Mark held up a hand. "Don't bother." He walked back to his car, leaning against it. Kevin frowned. "What are you?" Red and blue lights filled the street. The real police had arrived. Flashing red and blue lights bathed the quiet suburban street, the smug smirk on Kevin's face fading as reality set in. The HOA enforcer, who just moments ago had been reveling in his self-proclaimed authority, now stood stiffly watching as two uniformed officers stepped out of their squad car. Sergeant Miller, a grizzled cop with years of experience, approached with a confused but alert expression. "Chief, what's going on?" Kevin's face went ghost white. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Mark crossed his arms, his tone measured but sharp. "This tow truck is illegally blocking my property. The HOA impounded my car without proper notice and is refusing to move the obstruction." Miller's eyebrows lifted as he turned toward Kevin. "You got a permit for this tow?" Kevin fumbled with his clipboard, the arrogance from earlier replaced with visible unease. It's HOA policy." Miller's expression hardened. "Policy isn't law." Kevin swallowed. Mark smirked. "You were saying something about running this neighborhood?" The tow truck driver, who had up until now remained indifferent, began shifting uncomfortably. "Hey man," he muttered to Kevin, "you said this was legit." Kevin ignored him, taking a step forward and regaining some of his bravado. "Look, Chief, we can sort this out internally if you just—" Mark cut him off. "You don't get to dictate how this plays out. You made your choice the second you decided to pull this stunt." Kevin's mouth clamped shut. Miller gestured toward the squad car. "We need to verify the tow company's credentials. Run a check on their permit. Operating license." One of the officers nodded, stepping aside to radio dispatch. Mark watched Kevin's growing discomfort with satisfaction. He had spent years dealing with criminals, but something about taking down an HOA tyrant felt uniquely rewarding. Just when things couldn't get worse for Kevin, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the scene, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Richard VA, the HOA president, stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit, exuding the kind of confidence only a man drunk on power could possess. His smile was smooth, rehearsed, and completely insincere. "Here, Chief Reynolds," he said, adjusting his tie. "I didn't expect to see you here, in uniform no less." Mark turned to him, unimpressed. "I wasn't expecting to have my driveway blocked and my car stolen, but here we are." Richard barely blinked. "This is all just a misunderstanding. I'm sure we can resolve it peacefully." Mark chuckled. "Oh, you mean like how you handle everything else? Illegally?" Kevin's eyes flicked nervously between the two men. "Richard, tell them this is HOA policy." Richard shot him a look that said, "Shut up before you make this worse." "I'm sure Chief Reynolds understands that HOAs have the right to enforce community standards," Richard said smoothly. "If he received fines, it means he was in violation, just like any other resident." Mark pulled a folded letter from his pocket, the HOA notice Kevin had stuffed in his mailbox. "Right, let's test that theory." He held it up dramatically. "According to this, I've been fined for unauthorized mailbox decor, improperly installed porch light, and lawn not in uniform standards." He glanced at Kevin. "How much are these fines worth again?" Kevin hesitated before muttering, 500. Mark nodded. "Interesting." He turned to Sergeant Miller. "Pull the property records for HOA Board President Richard VA. Let's see if his property has any violations." Richard's eyes darkened. "You can't do that." Mark smirked. "Not to law enforcement, we can't." Miller gestured to his partner, who stepped aside to make a call. The tension between the men thickened as the neighborhood's residents, curious about the flashing lights, began stepping outside their homes. Then the radio crackled. "Sergeant, we've got the records. Richard VA's property has multiple violations: an unapproved backyard structure, overgrown hedges, a porch light that doesn't meet HOA standards, and an unauthorized flag display." Kevin's face drained of color. The tow truck driver let out a low whistle. Mark turned back to Richard, tilting his head slightly. "Should I keep going?" Richard clenched his jaw. "Oh wait, I forgot." Mark's voice was thick with mock realization. "You don't find your own people, do you? You only go after the ones who don't play your little power game." Kevin's panic grew, but Richard wasn't listening. His fake composure was slipping, and for the first time that night, the man looked genuinely concerned. Before anyone could speak, the younger officer who had stepped away to check the tow company's credentials returned. Ed Sargent, the tow company's operating on expired permit, has been illegally towing vehicles for 6 months. Kevin staggered slightly. Wait, what? Mark's grin widened. That's a crime. The tow truck driver threw up his hands. Whoa, whoa. I didn't know that. I just do what they tell me. Mark gestured toward the officers. Then I suggest you start cooperating. Where's my car? The driver fumbled for his phone, sweat forming on his forehead. I'll call the lot. They'll bring it back. Kevin, still reeling, looked at Richard for support, but the HOA president had gone quiet, watching the situation slip through his fingers. Mark took a step forward, his voice quiet but firm. Now let's talk about you, Richard. Richard stiffened. We've already confirmed that you selectively enforce fines and allow violations among HOA board members while hammering the rest of us with bogus charges. That's a pattern of misconduct, and given that the HOA funds are controlled by you, I have a feeling we're going to find financial fraud too. Richard's eyes flickered, but he quickly masked his panic. You're reaching, Chief. Mark pulled out his phone and opened an email. Oh, am I? Because I just received the preliminary record from the city fraud investigator. He turned the screen toward Richard. Thousands of dollars in HOA fees transferred to an LLC under V's name. Richard's fake smile faltered. Mark smirked. Oh, buddy, we're just getting started. Richard had spent years playing the role of an untouchable HOA dictator, but at that moment, his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The neighborhood he had ruled through fear and arbitrary fines was now watching, their eyes wide with curiosity and growing outrage. Kevin, the so-called HOA enforcer, stood rigidly beside him, his clipboard now nothing more than dead weight in his hands. The tow truck driver had already taken a few steps back, wanting no part in whatever this was turning into. Mark let the silence settle for a moment, watching Richard squirm before breaking it with a slow, deliberate question. So, Kevin, remind me, how much was my fine again? Kevin licked his lips, his voice coming out weaker than before. $79. Mark gave a slight nod. Right, and you towed my car over that fine before I even had a chance to pay it. But here's what I'm wondering. He turned back to Richard, locking eyes with the man. How much do you owe in HOA violations? Richard straightened his tie, clearing his throat. That's irrelevant. Mark grinned. Oh, I think it's very relevant. Sergeant Miller handed him a printout of the HOA's own records, the very documents they used to justify fining homeowners. Mark held it up for effect. Let's see here. An unapproved backyard structure, overgrown hedges, a porch light that doesn't meet HOA standards, and my personal favorite. He tapped the page with his finger. An unauthorized flag display. Richard's face twitched, but he kept his mouth shut. Mark turned to Kevin. Now, what's the fine for an unauthorized flag display? Kevin hesitated. $200. Mark let out a low whistle escaped as Mark said, 200. Huh? And how much for overgrown hedges, Kevin? Kevin wiped his brow. 300. Mark nodded, feigning deep thought. So that's what? Almost $1,000 in violations, give or take. Kevin didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The growing murmur from the gathered neighbors said enough. Mark turned back to Richard. So tell me, when can we expect the tow truck to take your car? A ripple of amusement passed through the crowd. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, but before he could respond, the young officer who had been checking the tow company's credentials returned. Sergeant, we've got a bigger problem. Miller glanced at him. Go ahead. The tow company's permit isn't just expired. It's been invalid for 6 months. Every vehicle they've towed during that time was illegally impounded. A sharp inhale went through the crowd. Mark turned his head slightly toward Kevin, watching the realization hit him like a freight train. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. W8, Kevin stammered, turning toward Richard. You told me everything was legit. Richard's composure slipped just for a second. Kevin, shut up. But he wasn't shutting up anymore. You told me all the paperwork was in order, that we were fine as long as we followed HOA policy. Mark arched a brow. There it is. Richard shot Kevin a glare that screamed, shut your mouth. But the damage was already done. The neighbors, already fed up with the HOA nonsense, were now outright angry. Wait a damn minute. A deep voice rang out from the crowd. Jim, the retired Marine, stepped forward, arms crossed over his broad chest. Are you telling me these guys have been illegally towing our cars for months? The tow truck driver took a step forward, lifting both hands like a man who had just realized he was standing on thin ice. Hey, I'm just a contractor. I do what they tell me. I didn't know the permit was expired. Mark turned to him. Then I suggest you fix your mistake. His tone was as cool as ice. Where's my car? The driver fumbled for his phone, dialing quickly. Yeah, we're bringing it back now. Should be here in. He looked at Mark nervously. 15 minutes. Mark nodded. Good, but he wasn't done. He turned back to Richard, who was still trying to keep his mask of authority from cracking. You know what I really hate? Mark said, his voice calm but edged with steel. People who abuse their power. Richard scoffed. This is absurd. If you think this little stunt is going to... Mark raised a hand, cutting him off. Sergeant Miller. Miller immediately stepped forward. Yes, Chief. Pull the financial records for the HOA. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. Richard's expression darkened. That's private information. Richard snapped. Mark smirked. Not to law enforcement. Miller's radio crackled as the young officer spoke again. Sergeant, the HOA's financial records don't add up. There are large withdrawals made to an LLC, one that's registered under Richard V's name. The street fell silent. Kevin, who had been gripping his clipboard like a lifeline, went completely still. Tow truck driver let out a low, "Oh man." Mark tapped his fingers against his arm. Richard, do you want to explain why highway fine money has been transferring directly into your personal account? Richard's face turned the shade of wet cement. That's an accounting error, Mark chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, of course, because mistakenly depositing thousands of dollars into your personal account happens all the time, right? Kevin's voice was barely above a whisper now. You told me the fines were real. Richard's jaw clenched. Shut up, Kevin. But Kevin wasn't shutting up. Not anymore. You used me, he muttered, eyes wide. Then he turned to Mark. I didn't know, I swear. I thought I was just enforcing the rules. Mark tilted his head. Oh, Kevin, you really thought you were working for a legitimate operation? Kevin looked like a man standing on a collapsing bridge. He took a step back, shaking his head. I need to talk to a lawyer. Mark turned to Miller. If Kevin cooperates, how much leniency can the DA offer? Miller shrugged. Could be significant depending on what he provides. Kevin licked his lips, looking between Richard and Mark. He wasn't smart, but he wasn't dumb enough to go down alone. I want to talk to a lawyer first, he said, nodding quickly. But yeah, I'll cooperate. Richard wheedled on him. You traitorous little, Mark smirked. Oops. Richard finally lost his composure. You think you've won, Reynolds? You're just a cop. You have no power over the highway board. Mark's smile didn't waver. Oh, but I do. He turned to Miller. Time to bring in the big guns. Miller nodded and dialed a number. Within minutes, two new figures arrived, a city fraud investigator and a state financial auditor. Richard watched them approach with growing panic. The investigator adjusted his glasses. Which one of you is Richard VA? Mark gestured toward the rapidly unraveling HOA president. Right here. The investigator flipped open a thick folder. Mr. VA, the city has received multiple complaints regarding financial misconduct, selective enforcement, and unlawful property seizures. Based on preliminary evidence, we are launching a formal audit into the HOA's financial records. Richard swallowed hard. You can't do that without a warrant. The investigator smiled politely. Actually, we can. Because the HOA is a nonprofit organization, it falls under state audit laws. Richard visibly paled. Mark took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. Looks like your little empire just came crashing down. Richard VA had spent years running the HOA like his personal kingdom, but now, standing under the glow of flashing red and blue lights, his grip on power was slipping fast. His once polished confidence was cracking. His jaw clenched as the fraud investigator and financial auditor flipped through documents that would unravel everything he had built. The neighbors who had lived in fear of HOA fines for years were no longer whispering. They were wide-eyed, some recording on their phones, others openly discussing just how deep this corruption might go. The silence that followed the investigator's announcement was thick with tension. Then Mark spoke. "Richard, you've been running this HOA like a mafia racket for years. Selective fines, fake violations, kickbacks from the tow company. Now we've got fraud, embezzlement, and illegal property seizures to add to the list. Care to explain where all the money went?" Richard lifted his chin, still trying to maintain control. "The funds were used appropriately, all for the betterment of the community." The fraud investigator smirked. "Right, because community betterment includes first-class plane tickets, luxury SUVs, and a personal vacation home in Florida." A stunned murmur spread through the crowd. Mark shook his head. "You stole from every single homeowner here, the people you were supposed to represent. And you think you're walking away from this?" Richard scoffed, but his voice lacked the smugness it once carried. "You have no proof that I personally took that money." "Oh, we have plenty of proof." The investigator pulled out a bank statement, holding it up for effect. "Care to explain why thousands of dollars from HOA fines were transferred into a private LLC account under your name?" Kevin, who had been eerily silent since agreeing to cooperate, visibly paled. He turned to Richard in horror. "Wait, you lied to me. You said all the fines were legit." Richard shot him a glare. "Don't be an idiot, Kevin. Keep your mouth shut." Kevin took a step back, the realization hitting him like a freight train. He wasn't an enforcer. He was a pawn, and now that pawn was about to take down the king. Mark arched a brow, his voice laced with amusement. "Kevin, would you like to revise your statement to the investigators?" Kevin swallowed hard. I didn't know. I swear, but yeah, I'll talk." Richard's fists clenched, but his eyes flicked around desperately, looking for a way out. "This is ridiculous," he sneered. "I have lawyers, powerful ones. This will never hold up in court." Mark crossed his arms. "Oh, but it will, because Kevin isn't the only one who's willing to talk." A sharp whistle cut through the air, and everyone turned to see Jim, the retired Marine, stepping forward. "I got a story for you," Jim said, his voice thick with restrained anger. 3 years ago, this HOA tried to fine me $1,500 because my American flag was too large for my front porch. When I fought it, Richard threatened to foreclose on my house. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman near the front, Mrs. Jenkins, lifted a trembling hand. "They fined me for planting tulips, said they weren't in line with community aesthetics." Mr. Patel, still clutching his old violation notice, scoffed. "I got fined for having a fence 2 inches too high." One by one, more voices joined in. "He tried to evict my grandma over a flower pot." "They towed my car when I was on vacation and charged me over $500 to get it back." "They threatened to revoke my lease because my kid left a bike on the lawn for 5 minutes." Richard's confident facade shattered completely. He could hear it now. The dam was breaking. The people he had bullied, the ones too scared to fight back before were finally speaking out. Mark took a step forward, voice calm but firm. "You spent years using fear and intimidation to keep people in line, but now," he smirked, "now it's your turn to be afraid." The fraud investigator looked over at Sergeant Miller. "We've got more than enough for a full-scale investigation. Let's seize the HOA's financial records and freeze their accounts." Richard snapped. "You have no right to do this." The investigator didn't even look up. "Actually, under state law, we absolutely do." Kevin, still reeling, turned toward the officers. "Am I going to jail?" Mark tilted his head. "That depends. Do you want to be Richard's fall guy, or do you want to testify against him?" Kevin's hesitation lasted only a second. "Oh, I'll talk. I'll tell you everything." Richard let out a frustrated growl. "You traitorous idiot." Mark let out a low chuckle. "Oops." The fraud investigator turned back to Mark. "Chief Reynolds, would you like to do the honors?" Mark smiled with pleasure. He pulled out his cuffs and stepped toward Richard, who stumbled back, eyes wide. "Why? You can't arrest me. I built this HOA. You have no idea who I know." Mark didn't break stride. "You're under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. You have the right to remain silent. I'll fight this." Richard screamed, thrashing. His 2 officers grabbed his arms, and pinned them behind his back. "I'll get out. I have money. I have lawyers. You can't." Mark smirked, snapping the cuffs into place. Yeah. See you in court." The squad car door slammed shut, muffling Richard's ranting as the officers secured him inside. Kevin stood frozen, watching the man he once followed get hauled away. A slow clap broke the silence. Jim, then Mrs. Jenkins joined in, and then the entire neighborhood. A cheer erupted, the pent-up frustration and anger of years of HOA oppression boiling over into a celebration. Mark let the moment linger, then turned to the fraud investigator. "So what happens next?" The investigator glanced at his notes. "Every fine issued under Richard's leadership will be reviewed and likely refunded. His personal assets will be seized, and depending on the investigation, we will determine if the HOA itself should be dissolved." Mrs. Jenkins gasped. "You mean we could finally get rid of this HOA?" The city inspector, who had arrived, quietly stepped forward. "Under state law, if a majority of homeowners vote against the HOA, it can be permanently disbanded." Mark arched a brow. "Oh, I think we know where this is going." Jim cracked his knuckles. "All in favor of burning this HOA to the ground?" Nearly every hand shot up. The inspector laughed. "Well, that was easy." He pulled out his clipboard. "I'll start the paperwork." The crowd erupted into cheers again. Some people hugged, others fist-bumped. Years of oppression gone in an instant. Jim turned to Mark, grinning. "So, Chief, you ever think about running for HOA president?" Mark laughed. "Not a chance in hell." Mrs. Jenkins smirked. "What if we rename it and call it the Reynolds Protection Association?" Mark shook his head, still laughing. "Nope, if you need me, just call 911 like normal people." The neighborhood roared with laughter. For the first time in years, they were free. The sun had barely risen when Mark Reynolds stepped outside onto his porch, coffee in hand, and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. It was a different neighborhood now. No more clipboard-wielding enforcers prowling the streets. No more absurd fines. No more threats disguised as community standards. For the first time in years, peace had returned. The HOA was dead. Richard VA, the once untouchable HOA president, was now behind bars awaiting trial for embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power. Kevin, the spineless enforcer, had flipped the moment he realized he was just another disposable pawn in Richard's game. His testimony, combined with the mountain of evidence, made sure Richard wasn't wiggling out of this one. And the best part? The neighborhood had voted overwhelmingly to dissolve the HOA entirely. No more arbitrary rules, no more selective enforcement. The homeowners were finally free to live without fear of ridiculous fines. The signs of change were already everywhere. Jim, the retired Marine, was repainting his front porch in a color that had previously been deemed unauthorized. Mrs. Jenkins, a sweet but feisty old woman, had already replanted her tulips, a move that would have once gotten her a hefty fine. And Mark? He took a long sip of coffee, watching as a group of kids rode their bikes down the street. No more threats from the HOA for unauthorized play equipment. It was a good day. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down at the message and nearly choked on his coffee. "Dude, we bought Vaughn's beach house." It was from Jim. Mark blinked, then he read it again. "What?" A second text followed, this time from Mrs. Jenkins. "You better pack a bag, Chief. We're going on vacation." Mark let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. This had to be a joke. But when he checked his email, there it was, an official notice from the State Financial Board. Subject: HOA Property Seizure Update. Chief Reynolds, as part of the fraud investigation, the personal assets of Richard VA have been liquidated. This includes properties purchased using stolen HOA funds. One of those properties, a beach house in Florida, was successfully auctioned. The winning bidder was a coalition of neighbors, led by Mrs. Jenkins and Mr. Patel. Mark leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow whistle. These people don't play around. Jim wasn't joking. The entire neighborhood had come together to pool their money and buy Richard's vacation home out from under him. Poetic justice. He fired back a text. "You guys actually bought his house?" Jim responded almost immediately. "Damn right we did. And guess what? We're renaming it." Mark rubbed his forehead. "Oh no, A picture came through. It was a brand new sign in front of the beach house. The Vest Villa. Mark burst out laughing. These people were absolute legends. A second message popped up. We need someone to cut the ribbon at the grand opening. Mark laughed again, shaking his head. Yeah, I'm the neighborhood reborn. It wasn't just the HOA's fall that had changed things. It was the mindset. For years, homeowners had lived in fear, too afraid to push back, too exhausted to fight the never-ending stream of ridiculous violations. But once they realized they had power, that they could stand up and take back their rights, everything changed. They started holding community meetings without any HOA oversight. They formed a neighborhood committee to handle disputes without the need for petty fines. Instead of policing each other over mailbox decorations and porch lights, they focused on helping each other. It was no longer about control. It was about community. As Mark watched Jim and a few other neighbors loading up their cars for the first ever villa vacation, he felt something he hadn't expected: pride. Because while it had started with him taking on the HOA, the real victory belonged to them. They had fought back, and they had won. Mark's phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't from Jim. It was a flood of emails, hundreds of them. Homeowners from all over the country. Some were celebrating the takedown. You have no idea how satisfying that was to watch. Others were asking for help. My HOA is just as bad. Any advice on fighting back? We need a Chief Reynolds in our town. Is there a way to start a movement? Because these power-hungry HOAs are out of control. Mark exhaled, scrolling through the messages. It was the same story over and over again. Abusive HOAs, corrupt board members, homeowners being threatened and confined into submission. His grip on his phone tightened. HOAs had power because nobody fought back, but that was changing now. Maybe this wasn't just about one corrupt HOA in one neighborhood. Maybe it was bigger than that. Maybe it was time to take this fight national. Mark cracked his knuckles, opened his social media, and started typing. Is your HOA corrupt? Have you been fined for ridiculous reasons? Tell me your story. Let's bring these power-hungry tyrants down together. He hit post. Within minutes, his notifications started exploding. This wasn't just a local battle anymore. It was a war, and Mark was ready for it. The end, or just the beginning.